These are 8 guests Johnny Carson banned from The Tonight Show, some for shocking behavior, others for offenses so subtle they never saw it coming. Carson controlled late-night television for 30 years with that famous smile and endless charm, but behind the warm exterior lived a completely different man, someone with an unforgiving memory and the power to end careers with a single word. A producer who worked with him for over 15 years put it bluntly: Johnny never forgot, and he never forgave, which meant crossing him once didn't just get you kicked off that night's show. It erased you from the kingdom completely. Another longtime friend said Carson came from Nebraska, but operated like a Sicilian, never raising his voice or making scenes in public, simply removing people from his life without warning or explanation. Given Carson's position in the industry, that removal had consequences far beyond just losing a booking. And as one NBC executive explained, being banned by Johnny didn't just mean losing one show. It meant losing the most important publicity vehicle in American entertainment. Tonight we're revealing the stories behind Carson's most famous bans, from the betrayal that broke his heart to the physical threat that crossed an unforgivable line. And some of these bans lasted nearly 20 years, lifted only after Carson's death made way for new hosts with no loyalty to the king's grudges. Rivers wasn't just another comedian who appeared on The Tonight Show. She was Johnny Carson's hand-picked protege, the woman he personally groomed to be the first permanent guest host in the show's history, a position that made her one of the most powerful women in comedy overnight. One writer who worked with both of them explained it like this: Johnny didn't just give Joan a platform, he gave her his implicit endorsement. And in an industry where women comedians were still fighting for basic respect, Carson's approval was like being knighted. It made her career. Over the years, their professional relationship evolved into genuine friendship, with Carson advising Rivers on her material, inviting her to private dinners, publicly praising her talent in an era when female comedians were routinely dismissed. Rivers saw Carson as a father figure in an industry where she desperately needed an advocate. And a longtime friend revealed something telling, that Joan used to say Johnny was the first powerful man in television who didn't ask for something in return for his support. He championed her purely based on talent, and she was deeply grateful for that. What happened in 1986 came as such a devastating shock. The betrayal began quietly when Fox, this fledgling network challenging the Big Three's dominance, approached Rivers with an extraordinary offer. Her own late-night talk show airing directly opposite Carson, with a reported salary of $10 million per year, an astronomical sum that would make Rivers the highest-paid person in late night. The offer was particularly tempting because Rivers had growing concerns about her future at NBC, where executives had made it crystal clear that when Carson eventually retired, Rivers would not be considered as his replacement. One television historian noted that Joan was approaching her 50s in an industry notoriously unkind to aging women, which meant the Fox offer wasn't just about money. It was about security and ownership of her career. Rivers accepted Fox's offer but faced an excruciating dilemma. How do you tell Carson, the man who had made your career and whom you genuinely loved as a mentor and friend, and a producer who worked with Rivers during this period confirmed she was terrified of that conversation, kept delaying it, hoping to find the perfect moment and the perfect words. That moment never came. Fox leaked the news to the press before Rivers could tell Carson personally, which meant he learned about her defection not from her directly, but from a headline in Variety magazine. For a man whose childhood had been marked by emotional abandonment, a distant father and a mother who withheld approval, this perceived betrayal cut to the core of Carson's deepest insecurities, and a staff member who was present that day remembered it vividly. Johnny went white as a sheet when he saw the headline, didn't yell or throw things, simply said, "She didn't even call me," and walked into his office, and that quiet hurt was more disturbing than any explosion could have been. Carson's response was swift and absolute, immediately ordering that Rivers' name never be mentioned on The Tonight Show again, with all clips featuring her removed from compilation shows and guest hosts instructed never to reference her, as if she had never existed in the show's history. His longtime producer Fred de Cordova revealed something chilling when he said Johnny told him, "She's dead to me." And when Johnny said someone was dead to him, he meant it literally. They ceased to exist in his world. Rivers attempted repeatedly to apologize through letters, calls to Carson's private number, even elaborate gifts sent to his home, and each attempt was met with the same response: silence. Her assistant remembered the packages coming back marked "Return to Sender," while the calls were never returned, as if she was screaming into a void. And the ban extended far beyond The Tonight Show, since Carson's influence meant Rivers became unwelcome throughout NBC and much of the television industry, with former friends suddenly unavailable, invitations drying up, her career entering a devastating tailspin. A close friend noted something heartbreaking: that Joan always said losing Johnny's friendship was worse than losing The Tonight Show platform. She could survive professionally, but the personal loss haunted her for the rest of her life. The ban remained in effect for the remainder of Carson's tenure and beyond, with Rivers not appearing on The Tonight Show again until 2014, 22 years after Carson's retirement and 9 years after his death, when Jimmy Fallon finally invited her back. Rivers had rebuilt her career through sheer determination by then, but the wound never fully healed, and in her final years she still became emotional when discussing Carson, telling interviewers he gave her career and she hurt him, and that pain never goes away. Wayne Newton's ban came from crossing a very different line: the threat of physical violence. Newton had been a frequent target of Carson's monologue jokes throughout the 70s, particularly regarding his Las Vegas image and what Carson called his suspiciously youthful appearance. And the jokes were relatively mild by Tonight Show standards, but they hit a nerve with Newton, who had spent years carefully crafting his public persona. The breaking point came in 1980 when Carson incorporated suggestive jokes about Newton's sexuality into his monologue, implications that were particularly damaging in an era when such insinuations could destroy an entertainer's career, especially one who performed in conservative markets. What happened next became one of the most notorious backstage confrontations in television history. A security guard working at NBC's Burbank studios that day recalled that Wayne didn't call or have his manager complain. He showed up in person, and he wasn't there for a friendly chat. Newton bypassed normal security protocols by using his celebrity status to gain entry to the building, then made his way directly to Carson's office, and according to multiple witnesses, he entered without knocking and found Carson reviewing that night's monologue cards. Carson's assistant, who was present for the beginning of the confrontation, remembered it clearly. Johnny looked up, surprised but not alarmed at first. Then his expression changed quickly when he realized this wasn't a social call. What exactly was said remains somewhat disputed, but Newton himself has confirmed the essence of the exchange, admitting by his own account that he told Carson, "You can make fun of my music, you can make fun of my hair, but if you ever make another joke about my sexuality, I'll kick your ass." Carson's assistant recalled what happened next. Johnny stood up very slowly, significantly taller than Newton, and using that height advantage, then without raising his voice simply said, "Get out of my office before I have you thrown out." The confrontation ended without physical violence, but its repercussions were immediate and permanent, with Carson personally instructing his booking team that Newton was never to be invited on The Tonight Show again, a ban that remained in effect for the remainder of Carson's 30-year tenure. A producer who worked closely with Carson explained it this way: Johnny could handle criticism and angry phone calls, but what he couldn't and wouldn't tolerate was physical intimidation, and in his mind Newton had transformed from a joke target to a genuine threat. There was no coming back from that. The ban had real consequences for Newton's career trajectory, since while he remained popular in Las Vegas, his national television exposure diminished significantly in the years that followed. One former NBC executive noted that being banned by Johnny didn't just mean losing one show. It meant losing the most important publicity vehicle in American entertainment, and for someone like Newton, who was trying to expand beyond his Vegas base, it was devastating. Newton has discussed the ban in subsequent years, expressing no regrets about confronting Carson, stating in a 2007 interview that he would do exactly the same thing today. That some things are worth standing up for even if there's a price to pay professionally. What makes this ban particularly significant is how it revealed Carson's zero-tolerance policy for anything he perceived as a threat to his physical safety or the controlled environment he created at The Tonight Show. Charles Grodin's ban came from comedy that hit too close to home. On paper, Grodin should have been a perfect Tonight Show guest, intelligent and quick-witted, capable of the dry, slightly sardonic humor that Carson himself favored. But what began as an entertaining deviation from the standard celebrity interview format gradually evolved into something that deeply unsettled Carson. Grodin first appeared on The Tonight Show in the mid-70s, promoting his breakout role in The Heartbreak Kid. And unlike most guests who arrived prepared to tell prearranged amusing anecdotes, Grodin took a different approach by playing an aggressively difficult version of himself, challenging Carson's questions and acting vaguely hostile toward the host. A writer who worked on the show remembered the first time vividly. Johnny was caught off guard but played along brilliantly, since Carson was a master of improvisation and he recognized what Grodin was doing, creating uncomfortable comedy through tension, and the audience ate it up. The success of that initial appearance led to Grodin being invited back repeatedly, with each visit pushing the confrontational persona further, and what had begun as light sparring evolved into increasingly hostile exchanges, with Grodin questioning Carson's interviewing skills, suggesting he hadn't read Grodin's book, accusing him of not caring about his guests. A director who worked on several of Grodin's appearances explained the problem. Only Johnny and the producers knew for certain it was an act, but to the audience at home it often looked like a genuinely uncomfortable interview with a difficult guest. The line between performance and reality became dangerously blurred. The breaking point came during a 1990 appearance, when Grodin's act veered into territory that struck too close to Carson's personal insecurities, and according to those present, Grodin began mocking Carson's delivery and questioning whether he actually cared about any of his guests or just went through the motions for a paycheck. A camera operator working that night recalled something telling. Johnny's smile got very tight, since there's a difference between his performance smile and his genuine smile, and anyone who worked with him knew the difference immediately. This was the forced smile that meant he was not amused anymore. What made Grodin's comments particularly cutting was that they touched on Carson's greatest personal vulnerability, his difficulty with emotional intimacy, and Carson had been married 4 times, was notoriously distant even with close friends, remained sensitive to any suggestion that his on-air warmth was entirely performative. A staff member who overheard the exchange revealed that Johnny played along until the segment ended, but the minute they went to commercial he turned to his producer and said, "We're done with that." Just those 4 words, and everyone knew exactly what he meant. Grodin was never explicitly told he was banned. He was simply never booked again during Carson's remaining years on the show, and when Grodin's publicists would call to suggest him as a guest, they were told politely but firmly that the show was going in a different direction or that the schedule was full. A booking coordinator who worked on the show noted it wasn't an angry ban like with some other guests, more that Johnny had simply decided that particular comedic dynamic wasn't worth the discomfort it caused him. He had hundreds of potential guests to choose from, so why keep bringing back someone who made him uncomfortable even if it was just an act? Grodin himself has acknowledged the ban in subsequent interviews, admitting that his confrontational persona might have gone too far, telling one interviewer, "I thought I was doing Andy Kaufman, but Johnny didn't find it funny." Shelley Winters' ban came from a single moment of explosive violence in 1975. Winters was Hollywood royalty, a 2-time Oscar winner whose career spanned decades and included classics like A Place in the Sun, The Diary of Anne Frank, and The Poseidon Adventure, and her talent was undeniable, but her unpredictable behavior had become legendary in the industry by the 70s. A director who worked with her during this period explained that Shelley was brilliant but volatile, could be utterly charming one moment and explosively angry the next, especially if she'd been drinking, which by that point in her career was increasingly often. Carson had interviewed Winters multiple times over the years, with generally positive results, since she was a natural storyteller with decades of Hollywood experiences to share. But behind the scenes, the Tonight Show staff had begun to worry about her increasingly erratic behavior. A talent coordinator who worked on the show recalled that she would arrive for pre-interview seeming perfectly fine, then show up for the actual taping in a completely different state. It became a gamble every time they booked her. Which Shelley would we get? The incident that earned Winters her permanent ban occurred during a 1975 appearance that went catastrophically wrong almost from the moment she walked on stage, and according to multiple witnesses, Winters seemed disoriented and was noticeably slurring her words as she settled into the guest chair. A camera operator present that night remembered Johnny tried to guide her gently through the interview, but Shelley kept interrupting, changing subjects mid-sentence, and making comments that didn't quite connect to the questions, and you could see Carson getting increasingly tense, though he was doing his best to maintain the appearance of a normal conversation. The breaking point came when Carson made what seemed to be an innocuous joke about Winters' weight, a topic she herself had addressed humorously in previous appearances, but this time her reaction was dramatically different. A stagehand who witnessed the incident said she just snapped. One second she was laughing, or at least appearing to laugh, and the next second she had thrown her entire drink right in Johnny's face. Not a splash or a sip, but the entire glass of whiskey, ice cubes and all. The audience gasped while Carson, drenched and clearly shocked, maintained enough composure to quickly call for a commercial break. But according to those present, his famous self-control vanished the moment the cameras stopped rolling. A producer recalled he stood up dripping wet and just walked off the set without saying a word, his expression absolutely murderous, and in all their years working with him, they'd never seen him that angry. Carson retreated to his dressing room, changed his suit and tie, and returned to finish the show, a testament to his professionalism, while Winters had been quickly escorted out of the building during the break. The aftermath was swift and permanent, with Carson personally instructing his booking team that Winters was never to be invited on The Tonight Show again, a ban that remained in effect for the remainder of his 30-year tenure. A producer who discussed the incident with Carson afterward explained it wasn't just about the drink. Johnny felt there was an unspoken contract between host and guest involving mutual respect and professional behavior, and Shelley had violated that contract in the most public and humiliating way possible. The ban had significant consequences for Winters' later career, and as a Hollywood agent familiar with her career noted, her film roles were already becoming less frequent due to her age and reputation for difficulty. But losing The Tonight Show removed one of her last remaining connections to a mainstream audience. She could still work, but her days of major publicity were effectively over. Winters herself later acknowledged the ban, telling an interviewer in the 90s that it was probably fair given her behavior that night, admitting, "I was in a bad place then. Johnny had every right to never want to see me again." Rich Little's ban was quiet, gradual, and all the more puzzling for its subtlety. For over a decade, impressionist Rich Little was one of Johnny Carson's most frequent and reliable guests, appearing on The Tonight Show more than 30 times between the 60s and 70s, and his uncanny vocal impressions of celebrities and politicians made him a viewer favorite and seemingly one of Carson's preferred performers. Little simply vanished from The Tonight Show lineup with no public falling out, no on-air incident, just stopped appearing, creating one of the most puzzling bans in the show's history. A talent booker who worked on The Tonight Show during this period explained that Rich's disappearance from the show wasn't like the other explosive banishments. There was no single incident you could point to. He just gradually became unwelcome for reasons that weren't clear to most of the staff. Little's career continued to flourish on other programs, and in live performances unlike other band guests. Remained a fixture on television throughout the 80s and beyond, just never again on Carson's Tonight Show. The mystery deepened because Little himself seemed confused by the sudden cold shoulder from a show that had once welcomed him so frequently. And in a 2010 interview, Little revealed he kept waiting for the call, and it just never came again. Eventually he got the message, but Johnny never told him directly what happened. According to those closest to the situation, the ban stemmed not from any public incident, but from a growing personal dislike that Carson developed for Little behind the scenes. A producer who worked closely with Carson revealed that Johnny found him increasingly annoying off camera, since Rich had a habit of staying in character, doing impressions constantly even when the cameras weren't rolling, and what audiences found entertaining for 10 minutes Johnny had to endure for hours, during rehearsals and commercial breaks. This tendency to remain on at all times reportedly grated on Carson, who valued authenticity in his personal interactions and grew tired of what he perceived as Little's need for constant attention and approval. A writer who overheard one comment recalled Johnny once muttered, "Does he even have his own voice?" after a particularly exhausting pre-show meeting, and it wasn't said as a joke. There was real irritation behind it. The final straw appeared to be more substantive than mere annoyance, and according to several sources, Carson became convinced that Little was recycling material on the show, bringing back impressions and jokes he had already performed on previous appearances, with only minimal changes. A longtime staff member explained that Johnny was obsessive about fresh material, had an almost photographic memory for comedy bits, and could instantly recognize when someone was repeating themselves, and with Rich appearing so frequently, Johnny started noticing patterns and repetitions that viewers at home might miss. For Carson, this perceived laziness was unforgivable, since he prided himself on The Tonight Show's quality control and expected guests, especially regular ones, to bring their best and freshest material each time. Carson simply instructed his booking team to stop calling Little rather than confronting him directly, and when Little's management would reach out to suggest an appearance, they were told the schedule was full or that the show was going in a different direction. The talent booker noted it was a soft band rather than an explosive one. Johnny never said, "I never want to see him again," like he did with some other performers. Just said, "I think we've seen enough of Rich for a while." And that while turned out to be forever. One former NBC executive observed that Johnny didn't just care about ratings. He cared about quality. And if he thought someone was coasting on past success or not putting in the effort to create new material, that was almost as unforgivable to him as bad behavior. Little himself finally learned the reason for his banishment years later, when a former Tonight Show staffer explained Carson's frustrations in subsequent interviews, and Little has expressed regret that he wasn't given the opportunity to address Carson's concerns directly. Little said in a 2019 interview that he could have created all new impressions if he'd known that was the issue. But in this business, you rarely get told why doors close. They just close. Truman Capote's ban came from appearing obviously intoxicated on national television in 1975. Capote was one of America's most celebrated writers, the brilliant mind behind Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood, whose razor-sharp wit and distinctive voice had made him a talk show favorite throughout the 60s and early 70s. But by the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1975, Capote was in the midst of a devastating spiral of alcohol and drug addiction that had begun to affect his public appearances. A stage manager present that night recalled you could tell something was wrong the moment he walked out. Truman was unsteady on his feet with slurred speech and eyes that couldn't seem to focus, and Johnny looked concerned before Capote had even reached the guest chair. Carson, himself no stranger to alcohol, had a strict professional policy about intoxication on his show, and while he enjoyed drinking in his private life, and sometimes referenced it in monologue jokes, he expected guests to be coherent and functional during their appearances. A producer who worked on the show explained that Johnny believed viewers invited him into their homes each night, and he took that responsibility seriously. Wouldn't embarrass his audience by showcasing someone who was clearly incapacitated. Capote's condition became painfully obvious as the interview began, with him struggling to complete sentences, occasionally losing his train of thought mid-word, making several inappropriate comments about other celebrities that couldn't be aired on network television. A director who witnessed the disaster unfold remembered Johnny tried every interviewing trick in his considerable arsenal, asked short, simple questions, tried to guide Truman toward topics they discussed in pre-interview, even attempted to turn it into a comedy bit at one point, but nothing worked. The breaking point came when Capote began telling a rambling story about a Hollywood party that veered into explicit territory inappropriate for broadcast standards of the time, and Carson quickly interrupted and threw to a commercial break earlier than scheduled. During the break, according to multiple witnesses, Carson confronted Capote directly about his condition, and a stagehand who overheard the exchange recalled Johnny leaned in and said very quietly, "Truman, you're not well tonight. We're going to cut this short." While Capote tried to argue that he was fine, but his words were so slurred that they just proved Carson's point. Carson quickly wrapped up the interview and thanked Capote for appearing when the show returned from commercial, and the scheduled 10-minute segment had lasted barely 4 minutes, an almost unprecedented abbreviation in the show's history. The aftermath was swift and decisive, with Carson personally instructing his booking team that Capote was never to be invited on The Tonight Show again, a ban that remained in effect for the remainder of his career. A producer who spoke with Carson after the show explained that Johnny was furious, but not primarily at Truman. He was angry at Capote's handlers for allowing him to appear in that condition, and at himself for not recognizing the problem before the cameras started rolling. The ban had significant consequences for Capote's later career, since The Tonight Show was the essential promotional platform for authors with new work to discuss, and losing access to Carson's couch meant losing visibility with millions of potential readers. A literary agent familiar with Capote's career noted that for a writer like Capote, who was already struggling with diminishing productivity, losing The Tonight Show was devastating, and his last major work, Music for Chameleons, received far less promotion than it would have with a Carson appearance. Sales reflected that. What made the Capote Band particularly significant was how it revealed Carson's standards regarding substance abuse on his program. And while he could forgive many transgressions, appearing obviously intoxicated on his show represented a form of disrespect that Carson found unacceptable both to himself and to his audience. A friend of Carson's observed that Johnny wasn't judging Truman's personal demons. He was protecting his show's integrity. There's a difference between having a few drinks before an appearance and being completely incoherent on national television. The Smothers Brothers' partial ban came from Carson's determination to keep the Tonight Show entertainment focused rather than politically charged. Tom and Dick Smothers were more than just comedians. They were cultural lightning rods whose CBS variety show had become famous and ultimately canceled for its outspoken opposition to the Vietnam War and pointed political satire, and their progressive politics and willingness to challenge authority had made them heroes to the counterculture and controversial figures to the establishment. A writer who worked closely with Carson explained that Johnny walked a deliberate middle path politically, would joke about politicians from both parties in his monologue, but never wanted The Tonight Show to become a platform for divisive political statements. And the Smothers Brothers, by contrast, saw their comedy as explicitly political, a fundamental difference in philosophy. Carson had a complex relationship with the brothers, respected their talent, and had featured them on his program multiple times during the 60s, but grew increasingly uncomfortable with their confrontational approach as political divisions in America deepened. The breaking point came during a 1970 appearance that quickly veered from entertainment into political territory, and according to those present, Tom Smothers began using his segment to deliver what amounted to an anti-war speech rather than engaging in the light banter Carson had expected. A camera operator working that night recalled Johnny's expression changed completely. His smile remained in place, but his eyes went cold. He hated being ambushed with agenda-driven content, especially when it departed from what had been discussed in pre-interview. Carson completed the segment without obvious tension, ever the professional, but according to staff members, he was furious backstage after the show concluded. Carson reportedly told his producer, "Too much trouble for what we get," a phrase that would become his standard assessment of guests who brought unexpected complications to his carefully structured program. What followed wasn't an explicit permanent ban like some other celebrities received. Instead, the Smothers Brothers entered what staff came to call Carson Purgatory. They weren't formally banned, but they mysteriously stopped receiving invitations to appear. A booking coordinator who worked on the show during this period explained it was a soft blacklisting. Their name was never formally removed from potential guest lists, but whenever they were suggested, there was always some reason why that particular week wasn't good, and eventually their management got the message and stopped calling. This partial ban lasted for years, with the brothers making only rare sporadic appearances on The Tonight Show compared to their previous regular status. And according to Tommy Smothers himself, these infrequent bookings came with strict preconditions about avoiding political material. Tommy Smothers revealed in a 2010 interview that they were effectively censored, could appear occasionally, but only if they stuck to music and non-controversial comedy. And the moment they tried to say anything meaningful, the invitations would dry up again. What made the Smothers Brothers situation particularly significant was how it highlighted Carson's determination to keep the Tonight Show entertainment focused rather than politically charged. And while other hosts of the era, particularly Dick Cavett, embraced political discussion and controversy, Carson deliberately positioned his program as an escape from such tensions. A former NBC executive noted that Johnny wasn't necessarily disagreeing with the Smothers Brothers' views. He was rejecting their attempt to transform his entertainment platform into a political one. Believed viewers came to him for a break from the day's conflicts, not a continuation of them. One television historian observed he was committed to entertainment first, not activism or advocacy. And guests who couldn't separate those roles found themselves increasingly unwelcome on his couch. Morton Downey Jr.'s 1988 appearance represented everything Johnny Carson was not. Carson had been hosting The Tonight Show for over 2 decades by the late 80s, had perfected his craft, creating a show built on civility. wit, and thoughtful conversation. And then Downey arrived representing a completely different vision for television. Downey was loud, confrontational, deliberately provocative, and explicitly political. And his syndicated talk show, which gained notoriety in the late 80s, featured Downey screaming at guests, blowing cigarette smoke in their faces, whipping studio audiences into near-frenzied states. A producer who worked on the show during this period recalled that Johnny represented old-school class and restraint, while Downey was the embodiment of the new shock television that was beginning to emerge, and Carson viewed him not just as unpleasant, but as a threat to everything he believed television should be. Downey was booked on The Tonight Show in 1988 at the height of his notoriety, and the booking itself was controversial among Carson's staff, with some arguing that giving Downey a platform legitimized a style of broadcasting that was beneath the Tonight Show standards. A talent coordinator involved in the decision explained that Johnny agreed to the booking reluctantly, felt that as the leading talk show host, he should at least give this new phenomenon a chance to present himself to a mainstream audience, and it was a decision he would quickly regret. Tension was palpable from the moment Downey walked on stage, and rather than taking his seat in the guest chair as protocol dictated, Downey played to the audience, encouraging their applause and moving around the set as if it were his own show. A camera operator present remembered Johnny's expression was arctic. He had these micro-expressions that the crew could read perfectly after years of working with him, the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible clench of his jaw, and these were warning signs that everyone recognized except Downey himself. Downey immediately attempted to seize control as the interview began, interrupting Carson's questions and addressing the audience directly rather than engaging in conversation with his host. And when Carson tried to steer the discussion toward Downey's background and the origins of his confrontational style, Downey deflected with increasingly loud and aggressive responses. A director who witnessed the uncomfortable exchange noted that Johnny tried every interviewing technique in his considerable arsenal, attempted humor and direct questions, even gentle challenges to Downey's approach, but nothing penetrated the persona Downey was determined to maintain. The breaking point came when Downey began criticizing other talk show hosts by name, suggesting they lacked the courage to engage with real issues in the direct way he did, and the implicit criticism of Carson himself was unmistakable. A stagehand watching from the wings recalled Johnny's smile never faltered, but something changed in his eyes. He sat back slightly in his chair, a move the crew recognized as Carson disengaging from a guest he decided was not worth his attention. Carson wrapped up the segment earlier than scheduled, thanking Downey with the polite but distant formality he reserved for guests who had disappointed him, and according to staff members, he was uncharacteristically blunt backstage after the show concluded. Carson reportedly told his producer, "That's not television, it's a circus act, and this isn't the big top." Downey was never invited back to The Tonight Show during Carson's remaining years as host, while no formal ban was ever announced, and according to those familiar with the booking process, his name was quietly removed from all lists of potential future guests. A former NBC executive explained it wasn't just that Johnny disliked him personally, it was that Downey represented a direction in television that Carson found fundamentally destructive, a movement away from conversation toward confrontation, away from wit toward volume. What made the Downey situation particularly significant was how it highlighted the generational shift occurring in television during Carson's final years, the emergence of a more aggressive confrontational style that would eventually transform the medium. A television critic who covered both men observed that Johnny was a gentleman hosting in an increasingly ungentle world, and Downey was the canary in the coal mine, a warning that the thoughtful, measured approach Carson had perfected was beginning to lose ground to something louder and more divisive. Carson's rejection of Downey was more than personal dislike. It was a statement about the kind of television he believed in and the standards he fought to maintain until his final broadcast. These 8 bands reveal a side of Johnny Carson that viewers rarely saw behind that famous smile. Joan Rivers' heartbreaking betrayal, Wayne Newton's physical threat, Morton Downey Jr.'s assault on everything Carson believed television should be. Each band had its own story and its own lasting consequences. What unites these stories is Carson's unwavering commitment to certain principles: professional standards, personal loyalty, creative freshness, and the belief that The Tonight Show should be a place of entertainment and civility rather than confrontation and chaos. That former producer said Johnny never forgot and never forgave. Carson simply had lines that once crossed could never be uncrossed. And in an industry built on second chances and public forgiveness, Carson's band stood as permanent reminders that some betrayals, some threats, and some violations of trust were simply unforgivable. The power he wielded wasn't just about ratings or influence. It was about maintaining a vision for what late-night television could and should be. A vision he protected fiercely until his final show in 1992. For those 8 guests, that protection meant a permanent exile from the most important stage in American entertainment.